silence for all those who have given their lives in the cause of Irish freedom. Those of you who might be here for the first time tonight are in for a very special treat. Diegan is an electrifying speaker. I'm sure he's going to live up to that. He's going to live up to that billing. And tonight, we'll get going right away. I'm sure at the end, Don will be taking questions and answers. Don is a historian, PhD, and most renowned, in my mind anyway, for the work that he did at the Rhode Island Irish Famine Memorial, which is down on the waterway. And anyone who hasn't seen that should make an effort to get down there this spring. It's a beautiful monument to the Great Hunger. Don's lecture tonight is titled An Irish-American Family History in 10 Photographs from the Famine to the Present Day.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Restrain yourself.
It was an excellent lecture, Don.
Is this thing going to move, do we know? The podium, in other words?
Yeah. Do you want me to move it?
No, I want it where it is. I don't want it to move. That's
Yes, yes.
that's the point.
If you lean on it.
Okay. Oh, I know that. That's all right.
Do you want to put a book under the wheel or something?
There's an idea.
Brakes on that thing.
Are there?
Jimmy, is there a break under there?
I'm looking.
No, it doesn't look like it.
This is Daily Club issued stuff. Well, hopefully.
Yeah, okay.
I'll get some more.
That's fine.
If that moves down, you're gonna run over James Conley's face, but other than that.
Somehow I don't think he's going to be concerned. If that's the worst thing that happens to him. Okay, I don't know that I'm gonna, that's right. I don't know that I'm gonna need the microphone, and I don't know that I'm gonna be able to stand up, but I'm gonna try to do both. Thank you all for coming. Want to thank the technical crew for finally ironing out the bugs. For those of you who know me, I want to assure you that I'm going to be mercifully and uncharacteristically brief tonight, so that we can all get downstairs and have a drink. And as Jim said, I will be happy to entertain questions at the end of my talk. I think that my family history may be of some interest because, like most of you, my family history is a famine story, an immigrant story, a Great Depression story, a World War II story, and a means of remembering those who came before us. All of you should have a copy of this handout. If you don't, there are plenty on the back table. And what I'd like to do, I think what will make the evening otherwise more worthwhile than it ordinarily would be, is not just that I'm going to be talking about my own family, as typical or atypical as the case may be, but I want to share with you some of the resources that I used when I was writing my book, The Shadow of Sacrifice, the true story of a Pearl Harbor survivor and his nephew and namesake. I am the nephew and namesake of that book, and one of the people who will figure in this presentation is my Uncle Donald, for whom I was named. In fact, he really carries much of the thread of our family story. So, with no further ado, if we could have photograph number 1, I would appreciate that.
Don, is it bright enough there for you?
Oh, it's fine for me.
Okay,
Sure.
I wanted to make the pictures come out.
As long as you can see the photographs, that's all I really am happy.
Okay.
I care about. So, photograph number 1 is in the center of that picture. The old man in the center of that picture is my great-grandfather, Francis Diegan. And Francis, as far as we know, was born in south central County Leitrim around 1837, which means that he was born before the Great Famine. Remarkably, he and his parents, Bernard and Catherine Diegan, and his brother Patrick all survived the famine in place in County Leitrim, while their neighbors starved to death or emigrated around them. When the famine ended and Patrick and Frances and their parents survived, there was not work enough for famine survivors to do to stay at home because of the changes in Irish landholding. And sometime in the very late 1850s, my great-grandfather Francis accordingly left the family holding to his brother Patrick and his father Bernard, and then went himself to lowland Scotland and settled, went first to the town of Dalkeith in southwestern Scotland, where he moved in with famine survivor migrants from County Monaghan, and he moved in with a fellow named Peter Marin, who had a daughter named Bridget, and Frances, young Frances, who was about probably 20 at the time, 20 or 21 at the time, married one of Peter Marin's daughters, Bridget, and in 1861, the two of them moved to the town of West Linton, about 5 miles from Dalkeith in lowland Scotland, and stayed there for the next 28 years, which in a way makes my family slightly unusual. Most of you may have heard the term two-boat family, one or two-boat family. The one-boat family means people who came from Ireland directly after the famine or sometime after that, who went directly from Ireland to the United States. A two-boat family, by contrast, would be somebody like my great-grandfather, who went first from Ireland to Scotland, and then eventually, as an adult, as a mature man, in fact, uprooted his family from West Linton in 1888 and sailed to the United States. If we could have photograph number 2, that would be very helpful. Let me know when it's up, if you would. Frances and Bridget Diegan had 8 children. How are we doing?
I'm trying to see where
We can pass out photographs if we need to.
All set.
All set? So are we on number 2? Okay. Frances and Bridget had 8 children who survived to adulthood. They may have had many more who died in infancy. And again, that's characteristic of the Irish immigrant experience. But one of the, they had 8 children, 6 boys and 2 girls. And one of the boys, you now see in photograph number 2, my grandfather, Bernard Diegan, and his bride, Anna Cross Diegan, my grandmother, on their wedding day. That picture was taken in Worcester, Massachusetts on June 21st, 1905. I can't, by the way, just to go back for a moment, I can't tell you anything about the date of the first picture that I showed you. I think it dates from about, of my great-grandfather, I think it dates from about 1900. I know it was taken in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I know that he was flanked by 2 of his 6 sons, but I don't know who they were, because my family is notorious for not labeling their photographs. But in any case, Bernard and Anna Diegan were married on June 21st of 1905 in Worcester, and they had 12 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. And I might say parenthetically that the Irish custom was to have names skip generations, so that Bernard's son, my great-grandfather was Bernard. His son, my great-great-grandfather was Bernard. His son, my great-grandfather was Francis. One of his sons was my grandfather, Bernard. Old Francis from County Leitrim had a number of sons, one of whom was also named Francis, but not his eldest son. Interestingly enough, his eldest son was named James. But in any case, my grandparents, Bernard and Anna Diegan, had 7 children who survived to adulthood. The eldest boy, being my future father, Francis. So what you get then is the alternation of the names of typically of eldest sons who were named after their grandfathers. And that's a typical Irish pattern. I found when I was researching the book that my grandparents on the other side, Michael and Agnes Dowd Donovan, did the same thing with their son and daughter. My grandfather Michael's father was Daniel. He named his eldest son Daniel. His wife was named Margaret. So my mother was named for her grandmother, and that's a very common Irish characteristic. So then my grandparents, Bernard and Anna, had, as I said, 7 children, 4 girls and 3 boys. The eldest of the boys was my father, Francis. His middle brother was named Robert, and his youngest brother was named Joseph. Joseph was born on March 15th, 1915 in Worcester, and a week after his birth he was baptized into the Roman Catholic faith as Donald, and he was always known within his family as Donald, even though his legal name was Joseph. So in the course of the book, to avoid confusion, I refer to him either as Donald or Donald Joseph, and to myself as Don Diegan. So if we can have photograph number 3, that would be very helpful. All set? So my uncle Donald was born, as I say, in Worcester in 1915. His father was a wire drawer at American Steel and Wire, which was one of the largest wholly owned subsidiaries of United States Steel in Worcester, and the blue-collar environment from which my family came is very much like that which most of your immigrant ancestors experienced as well. Before we go any further, let me just pause for a moment to talk about a little bit about some of the sources on my handout. If you want to do research into your own Irish family background, I would suggest that you do some of the following things, and there is no particular order in which you need to use any of the resources that I listed, but logically speaking, I think that the first thing to do is to, if you want to know about your own family background, go back as far as you can. You obviously know your own parents. You may not know much about your grandparents, but if you know what your parents' full names were, if you get their death certificates, it will tell you what their parents' names were. And you can do the same thing with grandparents if they were born in this country. What you want to try and do when you're doing family research is to go back as far as you can for which you have records, and city or town clerks are very helpful in terms of providing vital records. There's usually a small fee, but not much of a one. Once you've done that, if you're doing work in Rhode Island, I found the microfilm index archives at the Providence Journal, at the Providence Library, the index of the Providence Journal on microfilm would be very helpful. If you go there, the librarians will show you how to use the microfilm room, and the microfilm is very useful at the Providence Journal for finding obituaries and other pieces of family information. After you've done that, many of you have probably used Ancestry.com, and the other day, in fact, they were promoting a sale on Irish records because of the proximity we are at to St. Patrick's Day, and very often Ancestry.com will provide a free trial, so you can do family research. If you know the names of your Irish-born grandparents and you know when they died in this country, you can find their obituaries probably in the Providence Journal, and that will help you when you go on to Ancestry.com or the next source that I have, which is the Family History Ireland, which is a website that is kind of a general genealogical website. And I also say, in parentheses, you can Google any of the individual county genealogy societies. That is what I did because, as I said, my family came from Leitrim, and I had the Leitrim Genealogical Society produce a copy of my own family history, which I found to be extraordinarily helpful. To get them to do that, they are professional genealogists, and to get them to do that is not inexpensive. It costs quite a bit. But I found it to be a very valuable resource to learn about the roots of my family, which I could trace back, thanks to them, to about the year 1800. That's as far back as I could go. Some of you may already have done this, and some of you may be far more accomplished a genealogist than I am. I'm not a genealogist, I'm really a historian. But I found the work of the Leitrim Genealogical Society to be very helpful, and I have no reason but to believe that any other of the 31 county genealogy societies, which you can Google, would be equally helpful if you happen to know where in Ireland your ancestors came from. So, back to the photographs. My Uncle Donald dropped out of high school during the midst of the Great Depression, and unable to find work as an unskilled teenager, he joined in July 1934 the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. And the CCC was part of something called the Emergency Conservation Work Act, which was one of the most popular pieces of legislation enacted in the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's first term as president in 1933. And we know that collective legislation as the New Deal. And the Emergency Conservation Work Act, which created the Civilian Conservation Corps, was one of the very most popular elements in the entire New Deal. And here's the reason why. What the CCC did was to provide work for several million unemployed, unskilled, and very largely uneducated young men who needed something to do. But it also provided those young men with a paycheck every month with $30 a month, $25 of which by law they were required to send home to their families. And one of the qualifications for eligibility for enrollment in the CCC is that the families of enrollees had to be eligible for what they then called relief, what we would call welfare. So $30 a month, of which the enrollee could keep 5, doesn't seem like a lot of money, but back in the Depression, in the midst of the Depression in the 1930s, $30 a month was a great deal of money. And it enabled people to pay their rent, to keep food on the table, and to have a relatively decent standard of life, even in very difficult times. So my Uncle Donald served 2 tours in the CCC with an interruption between 1934 and 1937. And he did mostly forestry work. The CCC is known affectionately as Roosevelt's Tree Army. And one of the things that the several million enrollees did, among many other things, was to plant trees. They were involved in combating soil erosion, and forest fires, and floods. One of the ways to do that was by planting trees which held the soil in place. So my Uncle Donald served in 3 different places between 1934 and 1937. He served in Maine, he served on Mount Greylock, which is the highest point in western Massachusetts, and he also served in northeastern Oregon at a place called Canyon Creek. And this photograph shows him in his work uniform, and I date this photo, though I have no reason for doing it. I have 2 photos of him in the CCC. I date this particular photo from the summer of 1934 in Alfred, Maine. But my family, as I said, was notorious for not labeling their photographs, so that's a guess, but I think it's a fairly accurate one. Well, when my uncle's second tour of duty in the CCC ended honorably in the fall of 1937, he was told in no uncertain terms that he could not re-enroll for a 3rd time in the CCC, so he needed something to do. He needed a job, he needed a way of continuing to support himself and his family. My grandfather, Bernard, whose picture I showed you on his wedding day, had fallen on very hard times. He retired from American Steel and Wire, and along the way he developed a rather serious drinking problem, so he was of no value to his family, which meant that my uncle had to shoulder much of the burden of supporting his 4 sisters and his widowed mother. after 1940. So when my uncle left the CCC for the second time in 1937, he needed something to do. He drops out of sight for a couple of years and reappears only in July of 1939 when he voluntarily enlisted in the United States Army. If we could have photograph number 4, that would be very helpful. All set. This is a photograph from July of 1939, and Donald is the person on the right, the shorter of the two people. And so he's the shorter of the two people in the photograph. In any case, it's, thank you. And so this is at Fort Slocum, which is outside of New York City, in New Rochelle, just outside of New York City. And what makes this unusual is that he enlisted in the United States Army during peacetime. Many of us have relatives, fathers or grandfathers or older brothers or uncles who served in World War II. My father and 5 of my uncles, including my Uncle Donald, all served in World War II. But the thing is that they joined the Army either as volunteers or as draftees after 1940, when the Selective Service Act was enacted by Congress. But my Uncle Donald joined the Army during peacetime. What that meant was that he could essentially write his own ticket. There were a number of places that he could choose to go. Several of them had drawbacks. He didn't want to go to Alaska, it was cold and remote. He didn't want to go to the Panama Canal Zone, it was hot and humid. He didn't want to go to Puerto Rico, which, as we know, is devastated frequently by hurricanes. So he had 2 viable choices. One of them was the Philippine Islands, and the other was Hawaii. And so my Uncle Donald chose, fortuitously, to be enlisted for what was called the Hawaiian Department of the United States Army. So if we could have photograph number 5, that would be fine. All set? What this is his Donald's military ID. That picture was taken in September of 1939, just after the outbreak of World War II. He was at sea when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939, and he reached Hawaii in the middle of September 1939 and had his picture taken, and you can see it says United States Army, Hawaiian Department, and then it says status of bearer, and it says enlisted man, and below that there is his signature. Notice he signed himself Joseph J. Diegan. His confirmation name was John. So even though he used his own name, Donald, in the CCC application that he made out, his legal name was Joseph, so he signed himself on his military ID as Joseph J. Diegan, and you can see that. There. That's the equivalent today of a dog tag. That was the equivalent of that in September of 1939. My uncle was not only able to choose where he wanted to be sent, he was also able to choose what branch of the United States Army he wanted to serve in. And he elected to become a field artilleryman. There are 3 kinds of artillery in the Army. Coast artillery, which the definition of which is simply large guns in fixed emplacements on the coast, whose job was primarily to sink enemy ships. Anti-aircraft artillery, which is obvious, and field artillery, whose primary purpose was to support infantry regiments either in advance or retreat, as the case may be. So my uncle joined the 13th Field Artillery Battalion, which was based at Schofield Barracks, about 20 miles outside of Honolulu, on the island of Oahu. Many of you who know the novel From Here to Eternity by James Jones, or the film of the same name, will know that the climactic scene of the novel and the film involved the machine gunning by Japanese fighter pilots of Schofield Barracks on December 7th, 1941. My uncle was there. He was strafed by the Japanese. He was not wounded, but he certainly saw a great deal of death and destruction around himself. But before that, there are a couple of additional photographs that I'd like to talk about. And if we could have the photograph number 6, that would be very helpful. In May of 1940, my uncle was promoted from private to private first class, and you can see him there in his dress uniform. You can notice the palm tree, which kind of sets him in his Hawaiian locale. That picture was taken at Schofield Barracks, which, as I just said, was attacked by the Japanese in the aftermath of their onslaught on the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941. I used this photograph as the cover for my book. If you look at the bookmark which is attached to the handout, you will notice that that photograph graces the cover of my book. It was something that was an easy sort of life before the outbreak of war. The Hawaiian Department was not particularly a very much a stringent outfit. They were pretty relaxed and pretty carefree until October of 1941, when they began to prepare for war with Japan. They didn't know when it would happen or where it would happen, where it would start. But by October 1st of 1941, the troops of the Hawaiian Department, of whom there were about 50,000, were preparing for the imminent outbreak of war with Japan. That did not mean, however, that troops did not have a chance to have time off. And if we could have the next photograph, that would be fine. Here again is a photograph of my uncle, the short person in the photograph, with one of his unidentified buddies. And they are strolling along a downtown Honolulu street. And this is one of the rare instances where the photograph in question is dated. It was dated October 8th, 1941, which is almost exactly 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And soldiers could get a day's leave by simply asking for it. And I know because the photograph tells me where it was developed. It was developed at Smith's Drugstore on Hotel Street in downtown Honolulu. And Hotel Street was the red light district of Honolulu. And so it is entirely possible, though I have no evidence for this, that my uncle and his buddy and the person who took the picture, and I have no idea who that was, it's entirely likely that the three of them, along with the thousands of other soldiers and sailors who were populating the district at the time, might very well have been on Hotel Street for the nefarious threefold purposes, as they would have said, of getting stewed, screwed, and tattooed. Now, I have no idea that he was necessarily doing that, but it's entirely possible that he was, given the fact that the photograph, as I said, was developed at Smith's Drugstore on Hotel Street in downtown Honolulu. Well, I've already mentioned what happened to my uncle on December 7th, 1941. He was then transferred after the outbreak of the war with his entire division, the 24th Infantry Division, of which the 13th Field Artillery was a part, to the north shore of Oahu, where they expected an imminent Japanese ground invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. Nobody knows this these days, but the Army brass in Washington and the men on the ground, and particularly the Hawaiian Department generals on the ground on Oahu, expected that the Japanese would follow up the Pearl Harbor aerial assault with a ground invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. So they were expected that they would have to repel the Japanese from Hawaiian soil itself. That did not happen, but it caused tremendous stress among the soldiers and sailors who expected that they were going to have to fight the Japanese in force in their tens of thousands a second time in the few months after Pearl Harbor. The threat actually ended, the threat of a Japanese invasion of the Hawaiian Islands ended with the outcome of the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, when the American Navy scored a decisive victory against the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Battle of Midway. But before that, between December 7th, 1941 and June of 1942, most people in Hawaii, whether civilian or military, expected a ground invasion. In any case, my uncle was under tremendous stress, as were all of his comrades at the time. And he died in March of 1942 of a gunshot wound. The United States Army informed his mother by telegram that he had suffered a gunshot wound. It didn't say how he received it or when he received it or where he received it. As a matter of fact, the Army covered up the actual circumstances of my uncle's death, but he was initially buried in the post cemetery at Schofield Barracks, and the next photograph, if we could have that, will show a portion of his military funeral on March 20th of 1942. Okay. And you see there half a dozen men from the 34th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army firing ceremonial volleys over my Uncle Donald's grave. And my grandmother, Anna Cross Diegan, believed until the end of her life that her son had been seriously wounded during the Pearl Harbor attack, and that he had succumbed to his wounds in March of 1942. Even though he had written to his family regularly between the Pearl Harbor attack and the time of his death, my grandmother concluded, not unreasonably, that Donald did not want to worry his mother by telling her that he had been wounded. So when she had an interview with the Worcester Gazette, which was the evening paper in town at the time, she expressed the belief that he had been seriously wounded during the attack on Pearl Harbor and died of his wounds subsequently. And that had always been the story with which I had been brought up as a boy and I had believed as a young man. And indeed, until I started work on my book project in 2005, I had continued to believe what was essentially the received truth from my family, which was essentially, if you want the shorthand, that your Uncle Donald, for whom you were named, was killed at Pearl Harbor. That was the family story. And I began to unravel it when I began to do the research work on my own book. And eventually I found out, as I said, that the Army, in my uncle's case and in a great many other cases as well, actually distorted and covered up and misrepresented the circumstances under which he and many other service members died during World War II and ever since. All I have to do is remind you of the death some years ago of the pro football player Pat Tillman, who died in Afghanistan, and originally the Army said he was killed by the Taliban. In fact, it turned out he was a victim of friendly fire. So the Army, sadly, has a tendency to cover up the deaths of service members and not to want family members to look too closely or to inquire too strenuously into what actually happened to people. But when I found out what the actual circumstances of my uncle's death were in 1942, I said to my wife, I think I need to go to Hawaii to set things right and to have a proper memorial service for my uncle. So if we could get the next photograph, that would be very helpful. So then, this picture was taken in February of 2010, and after the war, my grandmother was given the choice by the United States Army of having her son's remains returned to the mainland United States at government expense for burial in a military cemetery here or in a private cemetery or religious cemetery if she wanted to do that. But her adult children believed that that would simply be, she felt that that would be too painful for her to do. And she felt, I think appropriately, that Donald belonged among the men with whom he had fought in the opening days of World War II. So she said, I will leave him in Hawaii. But after the end of World War II, the United States government established the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is in Honolulu, and it reinterred all of the men who had been buried in the post cemetery at Schofield Barracks, and I showed you my uncle's original military funeral. He was reinterred at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in February of 1949. I visited his grave for the first time as a college student in August of 1970, but I had no idea, and indeed my father and mother had absolutely no idea about the actual circumstances of my uncle's death. So I was concerned at the time that there was a discrepancy between the family story that he had been killed at Pearl Harbor and the date of death on his gravestone, which was March 18th, 1942. So that really was something I had at the back of my mind, and when I set out to unravel the truth and to write my book beginning in 2005, one of the first things I did was to think about his grave at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. And by the time I had completed my research and I found out what actually happened to him, I knew that I would need to go back to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which I accordingly arranged to do with my wife, Kathy, who took this picture that you see, and arranged to have a military chaplain, in this case, a retired Irish-American priest named Father Dave Travers, next to whom I am standing. And Father Dave conducted a wonderful memorial service for my uncle, and you can see directly at our feet his gravestone in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific with the American flag next to it. Now, let's move on to the last photograph, if we might. I have mentioned extensively my book, and I've given you a bookmark if you're interested in learning a great deal more about all of the topics that I've touched on this evening. That is a way to do it. And there is a great deal more in that book besides. There is a lot of famine material and immigration material, and indeed Jim mentioned at the outset of the talk when he introduced me the work that Scott Malloy and I have done on the Famine Memorial. There's a great deal of material in my book about the creation of the Famine Memorial, and particularly my writing of my portion of the narrative that is there, with which I think probably many of you are probably already familiar. But in any case, I am also, for the sake of full disclosure, as most of you probably already know, the current president of the Rhode Island Irish Famine Memorial Committee. And we have helped to fund the perpetual care of the memorial by selling donor bricks and flagstones. The flagstones are granite, and they are about the size of a regular flat grave marker. And I felt that I needed to really kind of bring the story to an appropriate conclusion, not only by having a memorial service conducted for my uncle in Hawaii itself, but also by memorializing him permanently at the Rhode Island Irish Famine Memorial. So there you see the flagstone that I purchased and had engraved in memory of my uncle. The last thing I think I want to say is that I was looking at the materials this morning, and that I presented to you just now, and I realized at the time this morning that I have flagstones in honor of my own parents and my own grandparents and other members of my family, including Donald. But what I have yet to do, and did not indeed think about doing until today, was to purchase an additional flagstone. There are about 30 left in total, blank at the memorial site. I had thought today that I really needed to purchase a flagstone in honor of my great-grandfather, Francis Diegan, the famine survivor, with whom I began my story this evening. And so I plan on doing that. Let me simply say about the resources that, the additional resources that I've listed, that NARA.gov is a wonderful research website. All you need to do with any of these is just enter the website into your browser, and it'll take you right to it. I don't know anything about Navy or Marine Corps records. All I was interested in was Army records and CCC records, and I've indicated how you can get those, and I've also indicated how you can go to the Famine Committee website and think about purchasing a donor brick or a flagstone if you wish to do so. So I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Don, I had come across when I was writing about Joseph Bannigan, who came from County Monaghan and eventually came to Rhode Island. But that in County Monaghan and those Ulster provinces, even though they weren't in Northern Ireland, but they were in the north of the Republic, there was a something of a seasonal migration over to that part of Scotland.
Yes.
Where some of them were involved in coal mining.
Yes.
And I know Pat Brady's doing a thing in the Molly Maguire's
Yes.
coming up. But some of them, I think, got jobs because they actually had some mining experience in Ireland, but we might not know that readily without knowing they went to Scotland.
Yes. Well, I believe that that is so, and what I would add to that is that there was a pattern of seasonal migration from northwestern Ireland, from Leitrim and Monaghan and Donegal and places like that, to lowland Scotland or indeed northern England. I read a very interesting book as a graduate student that dealt with, by a guy named A.R. Redford, that dealt with that very subject. And what they would do, they would leave home in the spring. They would go to the help to get the harvest in Scotland or in northern England. They would get enough money, more than enough money, to pay their annual rent for the plots of land that they rented from the Anglo-Irish aristocracy in Ireland. And then they would go home. And there was a very well-established pattern of that kind of migration. I'm not so sure about coal mining, but I imagine that that's entirely true as well. But I know most about the agricultural part of it, but it was a very well-established, long-established tradition, and I think you're absolutely right that it was a vital way of raising money and gaining experience for otherwise landless Irish laborers. I think you're absolutely right. Oh, let me also say, by the way, and while the rest of you are kind of nerving yourselves up to ask wonderful questions, let me also say that if you're interested in my book and you go to the Amazon website, and I checked it out this morning, not only could you buy my book brand new from Amazon if you want to, but they also list under their portion of my book sale, they also list any number of other people from whom you can buy it, and you can get it at a dramatic discount. If you visit the Amazon website, they will, and click on new or used copies of the book, it'll give you, and I checked it this morning, there were no fewer than 31 additional vendors from whom you could buy a copy of my book, either in hardcover or in paperback, at varying prices. So check that out if it at all interests you, and you can save yourself a great deal of money if you do so. So just go to Amazon, and then under that, directly under their listing of my book in blue, you will find any number of other vendors who have the book available at deep discounts.
Donald, did the Civilian Conservation Corps die with World War II or before that?
Yes, it did. The CCC was established in 1933. It had at its peak a couple of million enrollees, and it was disbanded in June of 1942 when, obviously, the manpower that it represented was needed for World War II. And I remember reading somewhere that 90% of the men who served in the CCC between 1933 and 1942 eventually ended up in the American military during World War II. General MacArthur, when he was Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, had wanted to militarize the CCC, just as the German labor service during the Nazi period had been militarized. But President Roosevelt and Congress absolutely refused to allow MacArthur to do that. But yes, indeed, the CCC was abolished officially in June of 1942 so that its members could make their way into the United States Armed Forces.
And the full name of your book is?
Well, you should have a bookmark attached to the handout.
Oh, yes.
The Shadow of Sacrifice, the true story of a Pearl Harbor survivor and his nephew and namesake. And as I say, photograph number 6 made its way onto the cover of my book, and I'm very pleased about that because I really think that it captures the project in its full, poignant nature. That's what I was trying to do, and that's what I think I did. I think I did right by my uncle and by the Irish community of which he was such a typical part. Any other questions? Yes.